Hello and welcome to another episode of the Business Report on the Wire. We're closing up a year which has registered sub 5% GDP growth. Things are looking grim and we're also stepping into another union budget next year. But what does the road look like ahead, both in terms of unemployment and indeed on whether or not growth can pick up from where it's fallen to? Joining me today is a man who's been an economy watcher for a long time. He was also former chief economic advisor and part of the Planning Commission, Mr. Nitin Desai. Thank you, Mr. Desai, for speaking with us. We're tail-ending a rather dismal year for the economy in terms of how growth projections have moved and how growth itself has moved. How are you feeling about the year gone by?
Well, I think this was, most of us were expecting it. It was simply that there are some people who thought that what we were seeing, which is after all the slowdown has been taking place over past 7 or 8 quarters. And it was clear that there was nothing which was reviving the economy. Because if you want revival from a growth slowdown, you have to have something which is pushing demand up, some change, if it is a cyclical thing. And we didn't see what that change in demand side was. A lot of people now are recognizing this. The slowdown in motor cars and two-wheelers has hit the industry very hard. But that's a different story slightly, because that is a story about the fact that the size of your Indian middle class isn't expanding as rapidly as people may have thought. So there's a certain saturation, there's a S-shaped curve, so there's a certain saturation. That's a structural thing. I personally believe that part of the explanation is the slowdown of income growth at the bottom half of the pyramid. If you look at what's happening in rural wages, if you look at what's happening elsewhere, if you look at the tremendous slowdown in the growth of what are called fast-moving consumer goods, then that's clear evidence to me that there is a serious slowdown in the income growth in the lower order, and that's very important. I sometimes give a graph of the growth rates of FMCG and compare it with what's happening to the overall growth rate. And it matches beautifully. The boom that you saw 2003 to 2011 almost matches high FMCG growth. Then you get a decline and then a brief build up again. And then again it starts a steady decline for the past 7-8 quarters. All of that shows up in FMCG. And I think we are seriously underestimating this part, that you cannot manage growth in India if you do not also address distribution. The idea that growth is one thing and then we will worry about distribution. And not just distribution in terms of handouts. Distribution in terms of income in the hands of people which they will spend. And that we have not paid attention to, not unique now, it's been there for a long time. So that's one of my theses. It's partly structural, partly cyclical.
I will come to income distribution in a bit, but I think where the large debate lies right now is whether this is structural or cyclical, which is frankly a moot point. The big question is how much more pain do we have for the economy going into next year?
I would say it's both structural and cyclical. The structural bit about the slower growth in the middle class than we thought would be the case is something which may take time to resolve. And it will mean addressing the issue which we will talk about later, the income distribution issue. There is a cyclical issue, and that the cyclical issue is the slowdown in demand, which has to be reversed. Where can that demand reversal come from? It can come if you have a sudden substantial improvement in rural prosperity. Let's say this year, because of the good rains, if the Rabi harvest is good, with food prices going up, if there's more prosperity in rural areas, you may see some revival of rural demand growth. That will help. There is, of course, public investment, but there, because of fiscal pressures, the scope is very limited. And I'll want to say a little bit later about how valuable is this whole idea of pushing public investment to revive growth. We'll come back to that in a moment. The third area where it can come from is export growth. This is one of the big gaps. I mean, we've had complete stagnation in our exports since, 2011-12. And it's true, the world trade has been slow, but the fact is, there are many Asian countries which have expanded their trade. Bangladesh, Vietnam, even China has expanded its trade and increased its share in world trade. We haven't. Why? Why is it that their trade has gone up by Cambodia? Their trade has shot up. Why is our share of world trade not increasing when other Asian countries are clearly doing much better? So it's not as if we could not have done better. And I think that's a serious problem. If the government does do something intelligent about that. But my worry is I don't see the signs of this. What have they done? They've given away a huge handout in corporate tax set-off, 145,000 crores. Not a small sum.
No.
Now that same sum had been used for demand revival through more spending, say, on Narega, or through a better implementation of minimum wage laws, or something more serious on exports than the sort of things that they have been doing so far. Maybe we could have had quicker revival from the present trend. On the present trend, unless the budget does something a little more intelligent than what they have done so far, I think it will take a little time.
Mitali Desai, you've actually been in that position. I mean, many of us are just onlookers, but you have been a chief economic advisor. You were part of the planning commission. Do you think this is a government that's just being advised very badly on how to go about things economically?
Let me put it rather simply. I come from an age when basically we who were the economists and analysts could give rational advice to the government, which they sometimes accepted, sometimes did not accept. But the procedure was clear. If you want me to put it in somewhat simplistic terms, it was Arthashastra which was determining policy. Today it is Natya Shastra. Do something dramatic, demonetization, dramatic reduction in corporate tax rates. They're interested more in the, if you like, the public relations impact in tomorrow's headlines than a serious analysis of whether that is something that will actually deliver what they think it was going to deliver. Did demonetization deliver? No. Has the sharp reduction in corporate taxes delivered an increase in investment? No. Because companies won't invest simply because they have more money in their pocket. They'll invest when they see demand growth. Today, they're not seeing that demand growth. And if your capacity utilization is coming down, you won't invest. So in a sense, you're right that investment can be a driver of growth. But domestic investment is not autonomous. It will come when people sense that the economy is reviving. So when the revival starts, perhaps 1, 2, 3 quarters from now, you may well see some results from the tax set-off. But it was a wrong move at the wrong time. It should have been done later. Right now, they should have focused on demand revival.
Let's talk about that rural part of the puzzle that you alluded to earlier in our conversation. And there's multiple problems there. There is rural distress because there is unemployment. Farm output has not been strong enough. You have made the case for labor income to be boosted as well. I want to talk to you about that and also what you make of the current farm income schemes, whether you think they are badly planned or badly executed.
I think basically we have a serious structural problem. In a sense, we have built an agricultural policy which was designed at the time of food scarcity in the mid-60s, when our whole focus was we must increase our cereal production. We cannot be dependent on PL 480 supplies from the United States. And we had this intensive policy of promoting mainly rice and wheat. What's the reality today? Public support through the budget for agriculture is mainly for rice and wheat. It's essentially just for rice and wheat. Rice and wheat, and if you include, say, sugarcane, because that is also procured by companies, the proportion of agricultural produce that receives really direct marketing support from the government is 20%. 80% by value of agricultural output does not really receive any serious procurement or price support. They may announce MSPs for all sorts of things, but the procurement is only of two crops, rice and wheat. And it's also leading to distortions, like excessive rice production in Punjab, and with water tables coming down. And because of the short gap between the harvesting of the rice and the wheat,
Burning the fields
the burning
down.
of fields. Earlier, when they used to grow corn, there was enough time for them to prepare the field for wheat. Now, this burning is taking place. So it's a completely irrational policy. Now, we have to change that. Our agricultural support has to be much more flexible. A very good example is milk. Now, milk is a success story in India. Why? Because we addressed the marketing issue and then took up the production and supply issue. And today we have created a system where even though the cooperatives account for only about 20% of supplies, their impact is sufficient to ensure a milk, that India is the largest milk producer in the world, becoming increasingly efficient and increasingly a force to reckon with, even globally. So I would say, now that's an example of a type of marketing system which we need for other crops. Do you have it for onions? Do you have it for potatoes? Do you have it for vegetables? Do you have it for oilseeds? No. And then what we do, we simply have a very
Ad hoc system.
ad hoc trade policy. Pulse production has come down. It takes us 6 months to realize it's come down, so we import the stuff. And the imported stuff comes just when pulp production has already started going up. So if anything, our trade policy heightens the fluctuations in prices that otherwise we say, how can you have a pricing system where, say, an onion price goes from 5 rupees to 100 rupees in 1 year? I mean, that shows there's something seriously wrong. No?
You've been part of this budget making exercise as well, oftentimes, Mr. Desai. And through the 90s, it was about the liberalization agenda, and in the 2000s, it became, for people watching, more about a social sector focus. What, to your mind, would be a more elegant way to go about, removing this rural distress, both in terms of farm income boosting, which is something you have talked about, and also helping this unemployment situation, which has really ballooned in the last few quarters?
2 or 3 things. One, in terms of reviving agriculture as an attractive and profitable occupation, we need serious reforms on agricultural marketing. Get rid of the Agricultural Produce Marketing Act, Essential Commodities Act. Allow a farmer to sell what he likes, to whom he likes, where he likes. Not the present restrictions that we have, that he has to go to the Aratia and the Mandi. We are only protecting traders. We are not protecting farmers. And most of the time, we don't even give proper support prices. That's a longer term structural issue. Also more complicated, more sophisticated marketing systems of the sort we have in milk, which combine supply development with processing, with market development. And we look at Amul. What a wonderful example of a company which is competing with the most largest of the world's consumer product companies. And what did it start as? It started as a group of cooperatives, farmers working in a small town in Gujarat. And that's what it has become. Why? Because it was integrated all the way. Now, if we can do that, that is something which will take time. And I don't think the government can do all of it. Here you should open up the system. More farmer producer companies being allowed to get into these fields. Allow large private retail chains to connect directly with farmers. Give farmers total flexibility in who they can sell to, where they can sell, and at what price they can sell. And I would say basically that's one set of issues. The second set of issues is all this will still not absorb the 50+% who live on agriculture. So non-agricultural employment is absolutely crucial. And that really connects with your policies on the small and medium sector. You're not going to create non-agricultural employment on scale in rural areas with large industries. It'll have to come from small enterprises of different sorts. How do you do that? And that's another big area of structural reform that is needed on the small and medium industry policies side. That's one crucial thing. In terms of immediate thing, a gradual shift from supporting of individual crops to farm income support, which is started now, is not a bad idea. So we will need some form of farm income support. Historically, if you look the world around, it's always difficult for farm incomes.
So tweaked in terms of outreach or tweaked in terms of quantum when we talk about farm income support?
I would say that this is something which will be a little bit of learning by experience as to how we do it and to who would we give it to, how do we reach out to laborers and so on. So it is going to take a lot of learning by doing. It's not as if this is something which any country has perfected so far. But it is a sensible policy, because then you're allowing the price system to play its role in regulating the distribution of land by crop and so on. But you're also recognizing that there will be a need to supplement agricultural incomes, because historically you can never keep pace with non-agricultural incomes, precisely because non-agricultural demand, growth for non-agricultural products always grows fast. So these are things which can be done. So this move towards income support is not a bad idea. I think all parties are doing it now. It's not something which is controversial. But how well is it working? That is something which needs to be done. But don't lose sight of opening up the marketing system.
Let me swivel to the other part of the problem, a large part, which is the swamp pit that the banking and financial space became over the last few quarters. Again, for many, what happened with IL&FS and how it was dealt with was seen as a huge misstep by the government, which had extreme cascading effects. Would you say that you would pin the problem back to there, and how bad is it?
Go even further. I think it was a profound mistake to shift the responsibility for long-term funding, particularly of infrastructure, onto commercial banks. Because commercial banks were not designed for that. Their whole philosophy, their approach was evaluating working capital requirements. And that's why it was delegated to the branch, because the branch knew that that fellow is a trustworthy man, that fellow is not. And it was something where there was a turnover over the year. So your deposits are shorter, or maybe some fixed deposits. The time deposits are growing, but nevertheless they are not very long term in nature. The liabilities that a bank has. So and its lending then also was not very long term. Now suddenly you shift them to a long term lending thing, and they were not designed for that. They had no capacity to evaluate those risks and the scale of funding, and then political interference in that funding. So I think the mistake on the way we ran our capital market goes back further. There's some good things we did, particularly on the stock market side, where there were some very important developments were made, SEBI. So there were some very sensible and good things which happened on the capital market side. But in terms of financial institutions and financial intermediation, this happened. Now, how did NBFCs come up? NBFCs came up basically to plug this gap. But NBFCs did not have recourse to long-term finance, because they were borrowing mostly from banks. And then when banks started getting scared, they started issuing commercial paper and so on. So the whole NBFC problem is part of the larger problem of a failure to tackle the challenge of how do you finance long-term investments. We have failed to develop a long-term bond market. And part of the reason for that is also that the people who normally invest in long-term bonds, pension funds and so on, have not developed in India at the scale at which we would have liked to see it. India's proportion of assets in the form of pension rights or insurance rights is much lower than in many other developing countries. So there is a bigger problem, a structural problem, which is because the way in which our financial system has been designed has not found a mean, rational way of financing long-term infrastructure. Now they're trying to do things to develop corporate bond market. But the key is we must increase the sources of long-term funds through much larger scale of savings for pensions and insurance and so on.
If I were to ask you to pick out one standout economic move or decision by the government this year, what would you pick if you had one to pick?
Stand out in what sense?
Stand out in the sense, a good one. I think you've told me many bad ones. Would there be any good one?
I'm trying hard. Well, let me say that some of the moves they've recently done on wages and labor reform are probably fairly sensible, though they will need to be worked out. Many people are challenging them on the grounds that they are undermining labor rights. Incidentally, unlike a lot of my fellow economists, I do not think India's problem is that we have excessive protection for labor. I have seen very little evidence to suggest that whatever labor laws you have constrained the downsizing of firms. If you look at the numbers of big firms and how their employment has come down, how they've shifted from regular labor to contract labor, I don't see anything in the labor laws which has stopped it from happening. So the idea that the reform we need is to loosen the rights of labor, I think is mistaken. Our real problem is that the vast majority of our labor has no rights. 70% of the people in India who are paid wages and salaries do not have a written contract. That's not my number. That's a number from the National Sample Survey. 70% do not have a written contract. And forget the guys who are casual laborers. I'm talking of people who are supposed to be getting a monthly salary. 70% don't have a written contract. We should start at that end. I'd do something like what Brazil does. Say you cannot employ somebody without a written contract. Even if you employ a domestic worker, you must have a written contract. What their salaries, what their rights are, what their leave things are, etc., etc. And it must be registered somewhere. So that's a basic starting point. Reduce the gap in protection between the unorganized and the organized sector. And this will require not just a lightening of the restrictions in on retrenchment, etc., in the organized sector. It also means tightening of the restrictions on the smaller units so that there's less of a gap. And there's no incentive for somebody to remain small simply because they evade labor regulations. I don't think our problem of, and I see that there is an attempt in the new codification to address some of these issues, though there are allegations that some of the provisions, like for instance, allowing retrenchment to be determined by states rather than by the center, will lead to some dilution. But let us see.
These changes in labor also come at a time when we are going through a period of multi-decade high on unemployment. Ironically, it is the highest within the strata that is a graduate. So they have a sufficient amount of education backing them, but they have no jobs. What do you read into it, and what do you think has fed into this phenomenon, even in the urban space?
I would say basically this is the problem of the absence of manufacturing growth in India. That today we are seeing this graduate unemployment, qualified people unemployment, because there's a limit to the extent to which the sophisticated services can absorb all of these people. Historically, in most countries, this has been the basis of manufacturing growth. Now when we come to distribution, I focused on distribution from the income angle, but that's another dimension of distribution which you must remember, the gross inequality in the quality of education for the masses and for the classes. And that if today in 1991, if we had started paying attention to the quality of our education, then today, 27 years later, 28 years later, I would have had a workforce of quality, which would have attracted a lot of people into manufacturing. Our problem today is most employers say, I'm sorry, but we cannot get people of quality from, people may be unemployed, but we virtually have to train them from scratch. You have schools which train people who can barely read when they come out. Now, if you can't read a manual, how are you even going to train somebody? So I think that is an even bigger distributional issue that we have failed to tackle. That you cannot run a modern country if you do have this vast difference in the quality of education for the mass of people and for a limited number who manage to attend the better institutions. And that is not a problem of one government. It's been a problem which has run a long way through. So a part of the explanation for this huge graduate unemployment is that that's not enough by itself. We need a need not just engineering graduates. We need people, skilled blue-collar workers. We need people who can read a training manual. And we need people who can learn new skills. This is what happened in China. This is a big, big difference between the East Asia and India. People talk of many things, but the one big difference that I see is what they did in terms of human resources, better education, better health, so that the difference in the quality of education and healthcare for the poorest person and the richest person was much smaller than what it is in our country. And we failed in that.
In the 60s, Mr. Desai, as you pointed to as well, we addressed agriculture with some aggression. In the 90s, we moved towards liberalization, which really changed the course for us. There was a period of consolidation, fiscal consolidation after that. If you were to sit down and advise the chief economic advisor at this point, is there a silver bullet on offer, a particular track that one could take to turn the course on what's been many dismal quarters?
I'd say there is no single silver bullet which I could easily identify. I wish I could. In a way, agriculture and the focus that we gave to agriculture in the mid-60s and 70s addressed what was the most urgent problem that was confronting us. The problem of liberalization and getting rid of obsolete trade and investment regulations that we did in the early 90s was also something which was urgent. And it was, I was there, I was not there in the 90s, but I was there in the 80s. And we had started talking about it from the early 80s, but we didn't have the political capacity to do as much as we would have liked to do. I can tell you one thing, that I remember once telling Rajiv Gandhi, saying that, sir, how can you have small industry restrictions and other restrictions on a product which you have placed on open general license? Anybody outside is free to sell in India, but within India you're tying people's hands. And he agreed with me. He says, yes, of course we must get rid of it. And I said, you should have a one-line rule that no investment restrictions apply to any item which is on open general license for trade. Now that would have been a limited liberalization, and he agreed, but he couldn't do it because there were too many vested interests involved. So that was correct. So we solved that. What's the vested interest that we have to resolve today? I think the vested interest that we have to try and resolve today is mainly, this is maybe a few of old-fashioned left socialists, but the vested interest is that I think we have neglected the interests of labor for far too long. We have treated labor as a problem rather than as an asset and a resource. And the labor plays virtually no role in the processes of economic decision making. So nor do farmers. They are just agitational groups which have to agitate in the streets in order to get what they want. The corporates have a role. The financial sector has a role. Foreign investors have a role, have access, direct access to policymakers. But the others have to do it through the street. So to me, if I had to identify, this is not a magic bullet, but I would say that starting to implement effective wage legislation, starting to implement a much better rational policy on agricultural prices and support, and trying to move away from populism in terms of free ye de do, free wo de do. I call it the Jayalalitha approach, which is Jayalalitha used to give pressure cookers. Now we've escalated it. It's not just pressure cookers, it's LPG cylinders and so on that we give. But it's basically the idea of that welfare consists of handing things to people. Welfare consists of building up people's capacity to be themselves. Giving them better education, better health, more opportunities, and so on. That is what we have to start tackling. But I'm sorry, that's too big. It's not a magic bullet. So the magic bullet that is, to me, the priority I would like to see is a much greater attention in macroeconomic policy to the distributional dimension. What are the impacts of the budget on the way in which income distribution will evolve? Unless our income distribution starts becoming a little more equal, unless the share of wages in manufacturing and services starts improving, it's about 30% in manufacturing now. And it's come down from about 38, 39% to about 30%.
Worst hit in the GDP.
A steady decline.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not blaming any one government for it. This is something which has been happening for a long time. So a budget which actually addresses distributional issues. The other one more thing, ease of doing business. The whole focus is the World Bank calculator. But the real issue is the ease of doing business for the 50% of the country which is not part of the corporate sector. The small industries, the farmers, and so on. Look at the number of, I just saw the number today. And a whole lot of people applied for these loans, etc., from banks. And 70% dropped out because the procedures are too complicated for us. And why don't you start looking at that? How do you make life much easier for the small entrepreneur? In fact, with GST, you made it more complicated anyhow. So these are the issues. If they start focusing on the 50% of the country, which is not the corporate sector, if they start focusing on labor and farmers, I think you will get a much more rational and sensible approach to policy than what we are getting now. Our policy today is completely focused on two things. How do I attract the people in the corporate boardroom, and how do I maintain political support through populist schemes? These are the two tracks of policy. Now, attracting support in the corporate boardroom is not such a foolish idea, but you don't have to just do that. You must also start addressing the other groups.
You write in your Business Standard column, a few years back though, you addressed this issue and you said, when it comes to equality, the crucial test is the political right of all residents. We must restore the principle of civic nationalism that considers all who are domiciled legitimately in a territory, regardless of their religion or ethnic origin. Some economists have raised the issue about social damage to this country and the fact that social damage could have far greater impact than any misshaped policy. Would you agree with that?
Totally and completely agree. Something in the region, if you look at the census numbers, something in the region of 400 million Indians live away from the state in which they were born, the place they were born. Now, a lot of them are women who are married and gone to their husbands' homes, etc. But a lot of them are people who have moved for this.
Work, employment.
If we want a sensible country, you will have to have a country which is much more tolerant about people who are outsiders. I grew up, I'm a much older man than many of you people. I grew up in the 50s. I was born in 41, so I grew up, but I know I saw the 50s and 60s. And the 50s near my village in Gujarat, there were a whole lot of people from Andhra Pradesh who came as construction laborers for building the dams, Ukai and the dam and so on, which were going to provide irrigation. They were welcomed and they're settled down there. They live there now in that area. And I saw a much greater acceptance of this type of outsiders coming in and so on. Look at the ease with which you have accepted the idea that practically all our nurses are from Kerala, wherever you are. So I would say that the reality is that at the ground level, people understand that I'm getting something from these people who are coming from outside. And we must understand that this is just in terms of region and so on. But also we have to look at it in terms of more broadly, in terms of what religion or whatever. And the only concept of nationality which is workable in India is a civic one. I'm an Indian if I have a legitimate right to live within the territory here. In 46 or 47, the Constituent Assembly decided that India was going to have universal suffrage. So they gave an instruction out that we want a universal electoral roll prepared in time for an election after the Constitution is formulated. And the instruction went out to the bureaucracy. And there was no universal electoral roll. The 1937 election had a roll which was separated by community. And of course, included only about 20% of the country. Now the bureaucrats received this, it has to be universal. And you see how they reacted. Said, universal means universal. So there was a collector in Bombay. He says, how can I leave out people who sleep in the street? Because an electoral roll has to have an address. So that's how the convention has developed of attributing an address of the nearest building to the person who sleeps in the street so that person also has a right to vote. There are many other examples. So they really took that principle of universality, and that is the answer of who is an Indian. That is the answer of a constitution of who is an Indian. And I think to open up the question is extremely dangerous. And I completely agree with economists and many others who say that this is probably a bigger threat to the prosperity, growth revival, etc. If you are going to see, sort of these types of ethnic battles, community battles in the streets, I'm afraid your growth and development will be jeopardized very badly. But that's not the only reason. You obviously have to do it because in the end we have to create not just an economy which is prosperous, but a society which is something that is harmonious, an environment within which people can live in safety and comfort. So I entirely agree. I may be an economist, I may talk of economics, but the social dimension is absolutely crucial.
We are all living in hope, Mr. Desai, but thank you for being so candid and open with your views. Thank you for speaking with us.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.